Training with heart rate for endurance cycling or any endurance sport is really effective, and it's really well established. It's been around for a long time, and it's quite a cost-effective way. If you have a sports watch or a computer on your bike or even a smartphone, you can pair a heart rate monitor chest strap. Some of the newer sports watches, like this one here actually, have an optical sensor on the back, but they're not yet particularly accurate. They're getting better, but they're not as good as using a chest strap. And also, if you're on a bike, it's often more convenient to have your computer on your handlebars so you can see it more easily. So how do you train with heart rate? Well, you need to set up some training zones. Training zones vary according to how you set them, what method you use. You can use either your maximum heart rate or what's known as your threshold heart rate. And to do that, you need to do a test. You need to establish what your maximum is or establish what your threshold is. Going by the approximation of 220 minus your age isn't a very accurate method, and it's wildly inaccurate for a lot of people. So how do you do a test? Well, the best way to test your maximum heart rate is to do a good warm-up, obviously making sure that you don't have any heart conditions or any problems, any health reasons why you shouldn't be training at high intensity. So get a good warm-up and then ride up a hill as hard as you can for 5 or 6 minutes and see what the highest heart rate recorded on your monitor is. If you want to test your threshold heart rate, do a hard 30 minutes, as hard as you possibly can for 30 minutes on a fairly flat route or up a hill, and take the average of the last 20 minutes heart rate, and that will give you your threshold heart rate reasonably well. So I like to work with 5 training zones. The zone 1 is intended to be called the recovery zone. Zone 2 is called the endurance training zone. That's the zone that you need to spend most of your time in when you're training for endurance cycling events. Zone 3 is known as tempo, and that's a pace that you feel a little bit, you have to concentrate to keep going at that level of effort, and you might only be able to do it for an hour or 2 even after you've trained for a long period of time and built up your fitness. Zone 4 that I use is called threshold zone, and that's around about what's known as your anaerobic threshold, which is the threshold heart rate that you tested in your 30-minute test. And you can sustain that for maybe 30 minutes to 70 minutes. So not a huge amount of time. So if you're doing endurance events, you need to be well away from that zone. But you need to train that zone because you need to go up hills, you need to vary your power, and therefore you need to have some training in that training zone. Zone 5 is called maximum aerobic, or the VO2 max, and that is, you might have heard of VO2 max. It's the maximum amount of oxygen, maximum volume of oxygen your body can use when it's working as hard as it possibly can, and that's the upper limit, the theoretical upper limit for aerobic activity. And then there are 2 other zones that are anaerobic zones, which we won't go into because you don't really need to train those for endurance cycling events. If you were going to do long road races where you have to attack and recover, then you do need to train your anaerobic zones. But if you're getting involved in that type of thing, then I suggest you train with a power meter, because heart rate monitors don't really work for high intensity training. I like to use the Andy Coggan training zones, so you can see those in Training Peaks, or he's written a blog. I'll link a blog article that he wrote about training zones. And also you can see the percentages on the chart that I've got on the screen here. For endurance sport, the best thing to do is to do about 80% of your training in training zone 2, your endurance training zone. It's not called an endurance training zone for no reason. The reason you need to do that is because there's a threshold other than your anaerobic threshold called your aerobic threshold, and that occurs at about 75% of your maximum heart rate for most people. And training below that level, a little bit below that level, means that you can get faster at this aerobic threshold. And why is that important? Well, it's important because you burn predominantly fat. There are 2 sources of energy when you're cycling. As you get faster, you burn more carbohydrates in your muscles. There's carbohydrate stores called glycogen, which you may have heard of, in your muscles and your liver. And you burn more carbohydrate as you go faster. But that's not as efficient as using fat as an energy source. So the important thing about the aerobic threshold is it's the point at which you start to burn this carbohydrate energy source and burn less of your fat energy source. The proportions start to change, you burn less fat and more carbohydrates the faster you go. And the carbohydrate energy system is less efficient, and also the carbohydrate supplies in your body are limited, whereas your fat supplies are virtually unlimited. You could last for hours, days perhaps, burning fat. Even the skinniest elite marathon runner who might have 5% body fat can still last for almost unlimited amount of time on fat. There are other things that are going to stop him performing before he runs out of fat energy sources. So by training a little bit below your aerobic threshold, your body gets better at riding, burning fat as an energy source, and over time you get faster and faster in that zone. Your heart doesn't beat any faster, but it pumps more blood. The volume of blood that it can pump with each beat increases, and also your muscles get better at using the oxygen in your blood. Everything becomes more efficient, and therefore you get faster, so you can ride faster and faster at this aerobic threshold. So you need to spend roughly 80% of your time in this endurance training zone, and that doesn't matter irrespective of how much you train. It's been shown that even elite athletes who train 20 to 30 hours a week spend about 80% of the even 90% of the time in zones 1 and 2, and it was also shown that recreational athletes were better off spending 80 to 90% of the training in the endurance training zone 1 and 2. The only proviso might be that you could probably spend, if you're doing fewer hours, you can probably spend more time in zone 2 and less time in zone 1. But don't be tempted to go above that, the upper limit of zone 2 into your threshold zone, because it's counterproductive. You'd make yourself tired instead of fit. So what do you do with the other 20% of your time? Well, in the other 20% of time, you should do harder training, and that helps you get faster at things like hills, where you need to work a little bit harder. Some hills are very steep and you're not going to be able to train within this endurance training zone, and in an event you're not going to be able to stay within the endurance training zone. Or if you're riding in a group with other people and you want to stay in that group, you might sometimes have to push a bit harder. So to do that and be able to work harder for shorter periods of time, then you need to train harder. So spend 20% of your time in zones 3, 4 and 5. Spending time in these higher training zones, particularly zones 4 and 5, requires you to do what are known as intervals. Probably rather than me go into detail about interval training now, it would be better check out one of my other videos on interval training and how to use it, because it is quite a detailed subject, and this video could get quite long. But the thing to do is to do maybe to identify 2 days a week, or if you're doing a lot of training and you've built up a good background and you can handle it, maybe 3 days a week. I find most people are okay with 2 days a week of high intensity training and the rest of the time in the endurance training zones. So on those 2 days a week, do harder interval sessions, maybe a ride where you do the climbs in your tempo training zone, so that you get used to doing a sustained effort for a fairly long period of time. With training you can build up to doing 30 to 60 minutes or even 90 minutes in that tempo training zone. But don't do too much of the tempo training, because tempo is still quite fatiguing, but you don't really get the same gains that you do in the threshold training zone. So I hope all that makes sense. Get your training zone set, get out and start to figure out how things are working for you. You can look at your training zones in the various apps, in the Garmin app or Training Peaks or Strava, and understand where things are, and just think of that 80 to 20% rule, or 2 days a week hard and the rest of the time in your endurance training zones. And good luck, enjoy it, please subscribe, and see you in the next video. Bye.